You didn't lose the ability to be bored. You lost the ability to survive it. Watch anyone at a red light, in an elevator, in a waiting room. In the 4 seconds it takes a kettle to click off, the hand moves before the mind decides to move it, not toward anything in particular, just away from empty time. We call this staying busy, staying informed, staying entertained. But underneath all of it is something stranger. Most people alive today have never sat with nothing to do for more than a few minutes without reaching for an escape hatch. That is not who we are. That is not what we were built to be. For nearly all of human history, empty time wasn't rare, it was the majority of the day. Hours of walking, hours of watching a fire, long stretches of silence between one task and the next, and somehow none of it broke people. Something happened between then and now. Something changed the terms of the deal. And here's the part worth sitting with. This isn't a story about willpower or generational laziness or too much screen time. Every generation blames the one after it for going soft. But softness isn't what's happening here. Something was built deliberately over more than a century to make sure that gap, the one between one task and the next, was never empty again. You didn't fail to resist it. You were never really meant to. This is the story of how doing nothing became unbearable and what that's quietly costing you. Rewind far enough and a strange picture appears. When anthropologists studied surviving hunter-gatherer societies in the 20th century, groups like the Jew/Honsi of the Kalahari, they found something nobody expected. These were not people scraping by every waking hour. Subsistence work, hunting, gathering, tool-making often added up to something closer to 15 or 20 hours a week. The rest of their waking life had no assigned task at all. Not filled, unstructured, long afternoons with nothing scheduled, and they didn't spend that time scrambling to fill it. They repeated old stories. They watched clouds do nothing in particular. They sat, for long stretches, in each other's company, saying very little. This wasn't unique to foragers. Farmers inherited it too, folded into the rhythm of the seasons, hours walking behind a plow, tending a fire, waiting for bread to rise, waiting for wool to dry, waiting for rain that might not come. Waiting, in fact, was most of the job. Here's the detail that should stop you. None of these people had a word for what we now call boredom. Not because life was constantly thrilling, it wasn't, but because empty time simply wasn't classified as a problem to be solved. It was just time. One influential anthropologist went so far as to call this the original affluent society, not because these communities had more possessions, but because they had almost no unmet wants and enormous amounts of unclaimed time. Affluence, in that sense, wasn't about accumulation. It was about how little you needed to fill your hours in order to feel like the day had been enough. Neuroscience has since put a name to what all those unfilled hours were actually doing to the mind: the default mode network. It's the circuitry that activates precisely when you're not focused on a task, walking, waiting, staring at nothing in particular. And it isn't idle. It's when the brain files memories, rehearses social situations, stitches loose ideas into insight, and processes emotion the day didn't leave room for. The empty hours weren't wasted time, they were maintenance. For nearly all of human history, this kind of unstructured stretch was mandatory mental upkeep, as automatic as sleep, and nobody had to schedule it. The world simply left enormous gaps, and nothing rushed in to fill them. Then something started rushing in. The first crack came from something as unglamorous as a clock. Before industrialization, time bent around tasks. You milked the cow when the cow needed milking. You brought in the harvest when the field was ready. But a factory couldn't run on the rhythm of cows and weather. It needed hundreds of people in the same place, doing the same motion on the same schedule. So work stopped being a task and became a block of hours. And the moment labor got carved into blocks, something unfamiliar appeared on the other side of it: off hours, dead time. Time with a label and no built-in task to absorb it. For the first time at scale, huge numbers of people were handed scheduled emptiness, evenings, Sundays, the long walk home, without the ambient chores of farm life to naturally soak it up. This new emptiness felt different. It felt like a gap. And the gap grew larger on purpose. Labor movements spent decades fighting for shorter shifts, and by the early 20th century, the 8-hour workday and the 2-day weekend had become standard across much of the industrialized world. It was framed as a victory, and it was, but it also meant something unprecedented. Entire nations of people were now handed regularly scheduled blocks of unstructured time every single week, with no built-in task attached to any of it. Nobody expected what filled it next. The newspaper arrived first, then the radio, arguably the first piece of technology built specifically to occupy attention on command, in the exact hours industrial life had just carved out as free. Television did the same thing, only better, passive, continuous, always on. For the first time, a household could fill nearly every idle minute with manufactured stimulation, and within a generation, that stopped feeling like a luxury and started feeling like a baseline. Somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, an entire industry realized something quietly enormous. Attention itself could be sold, not a product, the moment of looking. That single insight rewired how every future piece of technology would be designed. The goal was no longer just to inform or entertain. The goal was to be looked at for as long as possible. In 1971, an economist made an observation that sounds almost too simple to matter. In a world flooded with information, the scarce resource stops being the information itself. It becomes the attention needed to absorb it. Decades later, that idea would get a name, the attention economy, and it would become the operating logic behind nearly every screen you own. To do that, designers reached for a discovery from behavioral psychology, originally tested on pigeons. Rewards that arrive unpredictably are far more compelling than rewards that arrive on schedule. A pigeon that gets food every time it pecks a lever will peck occasionally. A pigeon that gets food only sometimes, on no fixed pattern, will peck obsessively for hours. It's the exact mechanic behind a slot machine. Nobody plays the machine that pays every time. They play the one that might asterisk. Then that mechanic went into every pocket on Earth. Smartphone didn't just bring stimulation into idle moments the way radio and television had. It made the reward unpredictable, personal, and available in literally every gap the day produced: the elevator, the red light, the 4 seconds waiting on a kettle. Every one of those gaps, which for most of human history had simply been silence, now had a machine in it, engineered by some of the smartest people alive, built to be more interesting than your own unoccupied mind. And here's the strange part. It didn't need to be more interesting than a great novel or a great conversation. It only needed to be more interesting than nothing. That is an extremely low bar to clear. Generation by generation, the baseline shifted. Each new layer of stimulation reset what normal felt like until ordinary emptiness, the kind your great-great-grandparents lived inside for hours a day without a second thought, began registering to the modern brain as something closer to withdrawal. In 2014, psychologists at the University of Virginia ran an experiment that sounds almost too strange to be real. They left people alone in an empty room for up to 15 minutes with nothing to do but think. No phone, no book, no music, just a chair and a button that delivered a mild, unpleasant shock if pressed. Beforehand, nearly everyone said they'd pay money to avoid that shock. Left alone with nothing but their own thoughts, most of the men in the study and a meaningful share of the women pressed the button anyway. One participant pressed it well over 100 times. Given a straight choice between sitting quietly with their own mind or inflicting pain on themselves, a striking number of ordinary adults chose the pain. Not because they were unusual, because the room was asking them to do something their environment had quietly stopped training them to do. Here's the detail that reframes everything. The word boredom itself barely existed before the world that created this problem did. Its earliest known appearances in English trace only to the early 1800s, and it entered everyday use largely through Charles Dickens's Bleak House in the 1850s, right in the middle of the industrial transformation that had just invented dead time in the first place. Older languages leaned on words closer to restlessness or longing or an unfulfilled ache, not the very specific, very modern sensation of unstructured time as an unbearable void demanding to be filled immediately. Boredom, as most people experience it now, isn't a timeless human condition. It's a side effect of a particular kind of world. Your ancestors weren't more disciplined than you. They were simply never handed a device engineered to make stillness feel like deprivation. And here's what that's quietly costing you. Every time the reflex fires, the reach, the scroll, the fill, it interrupts exactly the mental process that empty time used to trigger. The default mode network doesn't get its turn. The memory doesn't get filed. The stray idea that was 2 seconds from connecting to another idea gets cut off before the connection forms. Some of history's most cited moments of insight, described by mathematicians, inventors, and writers across centuries, didn't arrive during focused effort. They arrived during a walk, a shower, a long unoccupied stretch with nothing demanding attention. Creativity researchers have a name for this pattern too: incubation, the stage where a problem the conscious mind has given up on keeps getting quietly worked on underneath, and the answer surfaces almost by accident once attention finally lets go. That specific kind of mental space, where a scattered mind quietly reorganizes itself into an idea, requires exactly the kind of silence an entire century of engineering has been optimized to remove. Not every idle moment produces a breakthrough, of course, but the incubation stage doesn't get to audition for genius if it never gets time on the stage at all. And right now, most of it isn't getting any. This is why so many people feel a specific, hard-to-name unease the instant a screen isn't in front of them. It isn't weakness, it isn't a personal failing. It's a mind that has been systematically deprived of practice at being alone with itself, encountering, for a few unguarded seconds, the very thing it was never given a chance to get used to. So maybe the question was never why can't I sit still? Maybe boredom was never the enemy to begin with. For most of human history, that itchy, unfilled, faintly uncomfortable feeling wasn't a malfunction to be medicated with distraction. It was a signal, one of the oldest your mind has, telling you it was finally your turn to talk to yourself. A homing instinct calling you back from the noise, the task, the crowd, toward whatever was actually going on underneath. Every tool built over the last century to erase that feeling has also, quietly, erased the moment it used to lead you toward, the one where a memory finally settles, a feeling finally gets named, an idea finally finishes forming. None of that was ever going to happen on a schedule. It only ever happened in the gap. We didn't get rid of boredom. We got extraordinarily good at outrunning it, one gap at a time, until we forgot it was never chasing us away from something. It was calling us back to something. The silence was never empty. We just stopped staying in it long enough